Good evening, everyone. Oh, awesome. Audience response. Let's try it again. Good evening. Yes. That's so cool. Well, my name is Tyler Hahnemann, and I want to welcome you to the Minnesota Zoo and the Our World Speaker Series. I was just thinking, it feels like I haven't been here for such a long time, so it's great to see people. I'm glad that tonight's finally here and Karen's here. I'm pretty stoked. Hope you are as well. We also, just so you know, we're hosting a Google Hangout, so people from around the world are also for the clean water because of them. You guys get to come for free, so to thank them. And again, I know you're not here to listen to me, so without further ado, I want to introduce Karen Oberhauser. Karen is a professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota, where she and her students conduct research on several aspects of monarch butterfly ecology. Her research depends on traditional lab and field techniques, as well as the contributions of a variety of audiences through citizen science. Her strong interest in promoting a citizenry with a high degree of scientific and environmental literacy led to the development of a science education program that involves courses for teachers and opportunities for youth to engage in research and share their findings with broad audiences. In 1996, she and a graduate student, Michelle Prisby, started a nationwide citizen science project called the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which continues to engage hundreds of volunteers throughout North America. Karen is passionate about the conservation of the world's biodiversity and believes that the connections her projects promote between monarchs, humans, and the natural world promote meaningful conservation action. In 2013, Karen received a White House Champion of Change Award for her work with citizen science. I'd like to introduce you to Karen Oberhauser.
Thank you, Tyler. Can everyone hear me okay? I have this magic mic right here that I just want to make sure it works. Okay, before we get started, I have a couple of door prizes here. Can anybody tell me the genus that milkweed is in? Asclepius. I heard it first from the guy in the orange. So you get a book called Milkweed, Monarchs, and More. Good job. All right, how about the full scientific name of monarchs? Who said that first? All right, come on, ladies. These guys are Milkweed monarchs, so there's monarchs. Okay, the last one is multiple choice. I'm going to give you 3 choices. Do monarchs weigh as much as a dime, a nickel, or a paperclip? Whoa, who said that first? Very good. Flying paperclips. Congratulations. Okay, so this is a little book they got called Milkweed, Monarchs, and More, which I think is the only field guide to all the things that occur on one species of plant. All right, as Tyler said, we're here to talk about monarchs tonight. It says on the schedule 7 to 9. I'm not going to kid myself that I can be entertaining for 2 hours. So I'll probably talk about an hour, and we'll be happy to stay and talk with people afterwards. If you do have questions while I'm talking, feel free to ask them, or we can save questions for the end as well. So what I'm talking about is my work with monarch butterflies. Oops, I gotta get to know these. So I'm a conservation biologist in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. When I was in college and graduate school, there was not a field of conservation biology. It's a relatively new field. So I'm not trained in conservation biology, but I'm trained in ecology. So like any ecologist or biologist, I feel that a scientific field, to understand something, we need knowledge. We need to know what organisms need, how those needs can be met, and in the case of conservation biology, why in some cases those needs aren't being met, and then what we need to do to assure that they are met. So these questions up here could be answered by an ecologist. And what distinguishes the field of conservation biology is that conservation requires action. So it's not just enough to learn those things. We have to know the answers to all of those questions to preserve the world's biodiversity, but then we need to act on that knowledge. And that's what distinguishes the field of conservation biology from ecology, which is where I was trained. And also, there are a lot of terrible problems in the world. And it's very easy to get depressed about things like climate change and the incredible loss of the world's biodiversity and pollution, and there are just a lot of problems. And I think that we wouldn't be in this field, my colleagues and I and the people at the Minnesota Zoo who are working on conservation would not be in this field if we didn't have hope. So I think that that's really important for conservation biologists in a world that's changing very quickly, is we need to have hope, or we would all go home and do some other job. So with that little introduction to kind of a background on me, here are the things I'm going to talk about tonight, kind of the take-home points, and we'll go through these. First of all, we're going to talk about monarchs' natural history. They have a very complicated and exciting and interesting natural history. People are very interested in monarchs, so we're going to give some of the evidence that demonstrates people's interest in monarchs. But despite this interest, monarch numbers are declining. So that part of the talk has a few graphs. What's going on with monarch numbers. I'll talk about some of the reasons for the decline in monarch numbers, and then think about how do we as a society respond to a problem that has many causes. It's easy sometimes to respond to a problem with a single cause, but it's more complicated to figure out how to respond to a problem that has many causes. And then finally, think about from the realism side. So we require knowledge, we require hope, we also require realism. I think we may need to face the reality that we're facing a new normal for monarch numbers, and how do we kind of think about that? Okay, so natural history of monarchs. Monarchs have a complex natural history. So I'm going to start now. What's going on with monarchs right now? We think about this annual cycle of migrating south, which is what they're doing right now, overwintering at overwintering sites either along the coast of California or in central Mexico, then migrating back north and breeding. So if we look at this spatially, what monarchs are doing right now is gathering from this huge summer breeding range in kind of the northeastern quarter of the United States, a little bit into southern Canada. These monarchs are migrating south. People are starting to see them kind of through the middle of the country right now. They'll funnel through Texas and get to these overwintering sites in central Mexico late in October or early in November. They start arriving and keep trickling in pretty much through the month of November. So there are a couple dotted lines. We have another population west of the Rocky Mountains that migrates to coast along, or spots along the coast of California. We know that some monarchs from that western population also join the monarchs at their overwintering sites in Mexico, because we've had monarchs that have been tagged in southern Arizona that have been found in these overwintering sites in Mexico. There's also some monarchs that we think kind of take a wrong turn when they're trying to get to Texas and instead get caught going into the peninsula that's Florida. They actually join a continuously breeding population of monarchs that's in the southern part of Florida that keeps breeding all winter long. We're also starting to see some breeding all winter long along the coast of the whole Gulf Coast. That's, we think, an anomaly, but it is happening. Okay, so that's the fall migration. Monarchs then get to these overwintering sites, stay there all winter long. They leave in approximately mid-March. And then they start migrating north. So the same butterflies that flew all the way from Minnesota or Maine or North Dakota or wherever they started fly north. They get into the southeastern quarter of the United States, and then it's their offspring that finish the northward migration. And then they go through 2 or 3 more generations, non-migratory generations. So these adult butterflies only live for about a month, whereas the ones that migrate and overwinter in Mexico live 8 to 9 months. So there's a real difference in the biology of this one migratory generation and the generations that breed. And then they go through those 2 to 3 generations up here, and then the cycle starts again. Now, we're lucky with monarchs because when they congregate in these overwintering sites in California and Mexico, we can count them. So we have a handle on how the population is doing every single winter. In the sites in California, people actually count them. They estimate the numbers of monarchs that are in the overwintering sites in California, and that gives us a knowledge of how many monarchs, how successful the last breeding season was. In Mexico, we could never count them all, and what we do is we measure the area that they occupy. Okay, literally the area that's occupied by monarchs in Mexico. And we can count them when they first arrive in the overwintering sites and kind of coalesce, and then we can count them again just before they leave to migrate south. So we kind of have periods in their life cycle where we can understand how they did during the previous year's breeding season and how they survived the winter in Mexico. So we can really learn a lot about monarchs because they all get together conveniently for us and we can count them. So we can think of this cycle as what do monarchs need during every phase of the cycle, because their biology is very different during these different phases. So right now, during the fall migration, they need 2 main things. They need roosting sites that they stop in because they don't migrate at night. So they stop, this is a mesquite tree in Texas, and they're stopping along and resting at nighttime in that mesquite tree. And they also need sources of nectar. They actually gain weight as they're migrating. They're expending a lot of energy, but they're gaining weight that they store in their bodies as fat or lipids that keeps them alive during the course of the winter. So that's the main things that they need in the fall. During the winter, they need very specific microclimatic conditions that allow them to survive these 8 or 9 months. And what that is cool temperatures, but not freezing cold. Monarchs in no life stage, not like the butterflies we have around here, like the skippers you guys are raising, they can stand very cold temperatures. Monarchs die. They're like snowbirds. They go back to the tropics in the wintertime when it's cold up here, but they need cool enough temperatures that allow them to slow down their metabolism and stay alive until the next year. So they find this in these Oyamel fir forests in central Mexico. And then they move north, and as they're moving north, they're finding new milkweed plants. This is a southern milkweed called Asclepias viridis, or green milkweed. So here's a female laying an egg on a little tiny Asclepias viridis plant. Again, they need nectar sources during the summer, or during the spring migration, and during the summer, they need copious amounts of milkweed because that's when the population is growing. Over those 2 or 3 breeding generations, they need lots and lots of milkweed, many different species. Here we have, I guess I put 2 pictures of swamp milkweed, but there are actually 107 species of milkweed that are native to North America, and monarchs can use most of them. And they need nectar sources. And then the cycle starts again. So in order to figure out what's happening with monarch populations, we have very different things are going on during each phase of that annual cycle. So for example, if something happens in those Mexican overwintering sites and fewer monarchs can leave to migrate north in the spring, that very quickly, that lower population kind of cycles all the way through. And unless we have really good monitoring going on, it's difficult to know where the problem is. So we're doing a lot of work collecting data from all of these phases of the annual cycle so we can really pinpoint where the problems are, what are causing declines. So we have this cycle, and we all know there's a famous analogy of a chain, and a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. But every single link in the chain is important. So every part of that annual cycle is crucially important to monarchs. But I like to think that the whole cycle stands on milkweed. Okay, I go to the overwintering sites in Mexico a lot. I look at those millions of butterflies, and I look at each individual one and think each one of those monarchs grew up on a milkweed plant, most of them coming from the upper Midwestern US. So it's really important that we have enough milkweed. That's kind of like the base of that whole chain. All right, so that's just brief on the life cycle. Feel free to ask me questions about that if I didn't cover something you're interested in. I love to answer questions about monarchs. But I'm going to move on because I have 6 things to cover. So people are very interested in monarchs. Probably we wouldn't have so many people in this room tonight if I was talking about, you know, some little brown moth or a sulfur butterfly or something that, you know, isn't as lovely and interesting as monarchs. So here's some evidence. One thing is that monarchs are the state butterfly. This would have been a good trivia question. Anyone knows these 7 states? Monarchs are the state insect or butterfly of 7 states, including Minnesota. And I like to feel a little bit responsible for the fact that monarchs are the state butterfly of Minnesota because this happened because when Jesse Ventura was governor, there was a group of 4th graders in Matamidi, Minnesota, and their teacher had taken a class from me about monarchs that previous summer. And those kids were learning about how a bill becomes a law. And they got to pick anything they wanted. Their teacher said, let's decide what we want to become a law. And those kids said, we want the monarch to be the state butterfly of Minnesota. And it went all the way through, and Jesse Ventura signed that into law in 1999, or 1998. So that's cool, huh? So here are the other states, and here's what it says. This is a state statute of Minnesota. And 7 other states. So that's more than 10% of the states in the union have picked monarchs as their state butterfly or insect. I don't know if they have any skippers. Probably not, huh? So last spring, February 19th, 2014, President Obama and President Peña Nieto and Prime Minister Harper got together in Toluca, Mexico, and had a meeting. They have this meeting every year of the North American presidents. They call it the Three Amigos. George Bush came up with that name. And they, you know, they have lunch together, Josh, about the Olympics, blah, 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 blah. They couldn't agree on trade. They couldn't agree on immigration. But they did agree that they would create a working group to study ways to protect the monarch butterfly. So those 3 guys got together and decided they were going to protect monarch butterflies. This is actually fairly important because President Obama has just issued a memo, a memorandum to all of the agents, the big top agency guys in the United States, guys and gals, in the United States, and all of them are supposed to be working on preserving monarchs. So that's neat. But that is because a lot of people are interested in monarchs. Another thing that just happened 2.5 weeks ago, and I'm not going to talk very much about this, but I would be happy to answer any questions because it's huge, huge news. There was a petition submitted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list monarchs as a threatened species. So it was the Center for Biological Diversity, the Center for Food Safety, the Xerces Society joined in, and Lincoln Brower petitioned the United States through the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act. So there's a 167-page document providing evidence that monarchs qualify as a threatened or endangered species, and that's huge. Okay, so there's all that kind of interest in monarchs. I think more importantly, from a scientific perspective, is that monarchs are very intensively monitored. And most of the monitoring is done by citizens. It's not done by scientists. So there's not going to be a test at the end of this talk, so you don't have to memorize all these things. The point of this is a very long list. And these are different programs where people are collecting data that help us learn about monarch butterflies. All of the top program, or I guess I've got them, the bottom programs are specifically about monarchs. The top programs up to the Shapiro program are general butterfly monitoring programs, which also provide a lot of information about monarchs. So we have all these people out collecting data on monarchs, and they are collecting data on every phase of this migratory cycle that I told you about. And we can put all of those data together and really learn a lot about how monarch populations are doing and what are the key phases of this. What are the drivers of their population numbers? And then Tyler said this in his introduction, but this was kind of exciting that President Obama had a thing for citizen science champions of change. So I got to go to the White House and buy a suit for that. So this is an example. There are a lot of different programs about, like I said, people monitoring monarchs, but this is a really cool visual, I think. This is the Journey North program. Anybody in here collect data? Good. Hey. So you probably have dots on this map. You can probably see your dots. So each one of these little dots here is a person who went out and saw their first monarch of the year. And this is a picture of monarch colonization of the United States. And we can compare year to year, see how many people are seeing, see how fast they're moving, see where they're going. These are incredibly important data for understanding and conserving monarchs. So I could stare at those points for a long time. You can kind of see, so let's just, you can kind of see them getting held up. These are the monarchs coming back from Mexico. Then all of a sudden we get this burst into the northern United States. These are the kind of the reddish and orangish colors are the offspring. So they kind of, here are the ones coming back from Mexico. They're kind of stuck, then boom, they go into the northern United States and recolonize. So it's very cool, really, really important data. So a colleague of mine at the University of Maryland and I were interested in valuing this volunteer effort. How do we value what the information that people are contributing? And one of the ways to do that is to see how much time they put into it. So this map, which is divided into 1 degree by 1 degree cells over the whole United States, each one of these points represents how many hours in 1 year people contributed, volunteered their time for monarch conservation or monarch data, monarch monitoring. And if we add together all that time, the best, our best effort to add together all that time, it was like 41 full-time people. That really doesn't sound like a lot of people, but that's 52 weeks a year working 40 hours a week contributing data about monarchs. That would be worth a lot of money if we were paying all those people. So that's pretty impressive, and thank you all who are involved, because we have a nice big dot here in the Twin Cities. So people are also on the ground doing action to conserve monarchs. People are creating monarch habitat. They're doing it at nature centers and backyards and CRP land in native monarch habitat or native milkweed habitat. So all of these are great habitats for monarchs, and people are restoring habitat and protecting habitat. More evidence of our concern for monarchs. In many cases, they're registering their habitat as a monarch waste station. There are, actually the number is over 8,000 now. There are a lot more registered. Anybody have a monarch waste station? Good, very good. So that is more evidence of people's love for monarchs. Monarchs are used in a lot of educational venues. So in all 3 countries, these 2 pictures down in this corner are in Mexico, kids and adults. These adults are learning to monitor in the overwintering colonies. Kids drawing pictures of monarchs with nice little smiley faces. In Mexico, kids at a nature center. In Georgia, kids in Minnesota collecting data on monarchs. This was actually the field right next to where they sprayed the soybean aphids. Now that I think of that conversation. So really valuable for teaching kids about nature, teaching kids about science, insects, migrations. Kids can learn a lot by learning about monarchs. Also, I was involved in a study where we did something called a willingness to pay survey. So it's difficult to value something that doesn't have economic value. So we were interested in how much money people would pay to save monarchs. It turns out, so we did this survey of people, a random sample of people all over the United States, and it turns out that people would pay up to and depending on how you did the math, $4 to $6 billion to save monarch butterflies. I love this. It's an unusually lovable bug. The people's choice. People will shell out money for monarchs. So that is a powerful bit of information that we can use to leverage conservation for monarchs. And just to kind of put that in perspective, that's how much people would pay to save wolves and whooping cranes, which are, big megavertebrates that people really know about. So we think this is the first willingness to pay survey of an insect. And this is something that's kind of interesting. One of the questions on this survey was, how aware were you that monarch numbers were in decline? And there were 4 levels not aware at all. So the different colors on this map are awareness, with people in the yellow not being very aware. So this is just extrapolating over the United States. And you can see we have great awareness here in Minnesota that monarch numbers are in decline. We have the only brown dots, which is the highest level of awareness on this map. So, we in Minnesota are quite aware of monarch population numbers declining. So, in some ways, it's quite humbling to study an insect that people care so much about. Scientists are kind of used to getting in our little labs and doing things that people really don't care all that much. So when I first started studying monarchs, it had nothing to do with conservation or education. I was interested in because of their sex life, really. But then all of a sudden, I realized this is a really valuable conservation tool. So I think a lot about what it is about monarchs that attracts so many people, that you have a way station, you collect data for Journey North. So here are my theories. You can come up with your own reasons. They're incredibly beautiful. The adults are really beautiful, but they're not only beautiful as adults, they're beautiful as caterpillars, and they're beautiful as pupae. More beautiful than your skippers, guys, sorry. They're also very familiar. I mean, people see monarchs when they're little kids, and they remember that. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people's stories of when they first got interested in monarchs. I've heard a lot of those stories over my career. So they're just something that's kind of ingrained in people's lives. They're also very interesting. Here are my cages when I used to study their sex lives. But we've learned about insect reproduction, insect migration, interactions between insects and their host plants, between insects and their predators and parasitoids, migration, temperature tolerance, all sorts of things we've learned from monarchs, and we're continuing to learn more from them. And they're also really impressive. So the answer to the question about the paperclip, this monarch weighs as much as a paperclip. It can fly all the way from Minnesota to Mexico. Imagine a little paperclip going all that way. The wind is blowing and lots of things are happening. And that's very impressive. I think it really catches people's imagination. So is there anybody in here I haven't covered your interest in monarchs? Any other reasons? I'd love to add another thing. Yeah. Is it in the DNA? What? Yeah. It's not like, nobody's teaching them to do it. It's got to be in the DNA, but that's amazing because most generations don't migrate. So then somehow those butterflies at this time of year know we're leaving Minnesota. It's going to get cold here. We can't survive here. We're going to go to Mexico. It's really amazing. So that's ingrained in their DNA, and it's not only that they know in quotation marks when it's time to go, but they also know where to go. They go to the same place every year. So it is really impressive, I agree. Well, that's a hard question to answer. There's no evidence that they do. So people have looked at that using genetic studies, and then we would expect to see kind of differentiated populations. But it seems to be the word for this is there's a scientific word, it's called panmictic. And that means it's one big, happy interbreeding population without separate, like a Minnesota male is more likely to breed with a Minnesota female and their offspring are going to come back to Minnesota. We have no evidence that that happens. Is that true of California too? Or are they genetically So really good question. There are very small differences between the eastern and the western migratory population, but they're they're very small, suggesting either that they've very recently diverged or there's a lot of gene flow between them. We think that because some migrate from Arizona, and there's probably some crossing over the Rocky Mountains as well, so they're staying pretty much one population. But there's a little bit more difference between the two populations than within the populations. Mm-hmm. We don't know. And we don't know if it's something happening with when the ones that stay, like the ones in Florida, you mean? So we know that monarchs from the East Coast, the Northeast, join those monarchs in Florida, and we don't know if they stay there then or if they come back north in the spring. It's kind of hard to study those things. And now that we're seeing breeding in Texas, we don't know if it's just they happen to run into some milkweed in good condition and switch off their physiology so that they stop migrating. Or it could be that the ones in poor condition, like they might have this sense of, whoa, I'm not going to get all the way to Mexico and survive all winter. And the only way I'm going to get my genes into the next population is to stop here and breed. Might be something like that going on. We just don't know the mechanism for what's causing that. Okay, one more question. So monarchs, like all butterflies, they are pollinators, but they're not great pollinators. So the best pollinators are bees. And the reason that bees are so good at pollination is they feed their larvae pollen. So they have, little hairs and sacs and cool things on their bodies that pick up pollen from flowers. So they're built to be good at transmitting pollen. And they've got it in their hairs, and they go to another flower and it comes off. And butterflies don't have anything like that, so it's kind of an accident if pollen gets stuck on them. So they're not great pollinators, but they are pollinators. They are very important in food chains. Caterpillars of butterflies and moths are hugely important to birds. So the birds you see in your yard, there have been studies done of this, is a yard that has native plants will feed butterflies and moths, and a yard that has native plants or an area with native plants has more species of and more numbers of birds because there's more food for them. So that's an important role that they play. Okay, one more. So, yep. Yeah, well, the canary in the coal mine thing of they're telling us because we can monitor monarchs and kind of have a handle on what's going on with their population, probably the same things are happening to other organisms. And they're also, I think, an important flagship species. So they tell us what's going on, but they also excite us. And I think that it's important to have these kinds of these species that make these connections for people, because there's a lot of literature on how people are losing connection to nature right now, and monarchs, for many reasons, help make those connections for people. So lots and lots of reasons for that. Oh, I was even going to talk about the pollinator thing. So here we have, I forgot I put this slide in. I anticipated your question. So they are, they will go to flowers, they will move pollen around, but they're not great. So, I think we shouldn't like lie to people and say they're really important pollinators, and that's why we should save them. Okay, despite our interest, all that interest that I just showed you, monarch numbers are in decline. So this is the biggest graph about this. This is the area occupied by monarchs in the overwintering sites in Mexico in hectares. So to get to acres, you multiply that number by like 2.3, or you guys It's about 2.3, 2.4, something like that. But you can see the area is going down. Last winter was the very lowest year ever. The previous year, winter 2012, 2013 was the previous low. This number was a little bit more than half of this number. That is a really steep decline. So you can see the population has been going up and down for a long time, and if we would stop right about here, it's hard to say. We have this really high year that kind of throws things off, which is, by the way, the first year that I went to the overwintering sites. Yeah. So you know, we kind of, you know, up and down, but we've never had 4 years in a row of down before. You know, usually a low year. This low year was followed by another low year, but this, you know, usually they go up after a low year. So, you know, this is a statistically and biologically significant decline, and it's very scary. You know, we went from almost 20 hectares to this number is 0.67. We had, this was a really good summer for them. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the monitoring programs, except this Mexico program started in, actually we have data further back, but these people started collecting the data in 1993, but none of the other northern monitoring programs were going yet. So we don't really know exactly what was going on with the population. Most of the other programs on that list started right about in here. Okay, the similar thing is happening, but not quite as dramatic recently. This is the colony numbers in the United States. So this is the western, along the coast of California. This is total abundance. So you can see there's been a high in the million, you know, over 1 million monarchs counted at these overwintering sites. Recently, it's been kind of in the 250,000, you know, 100 or so million. But this is, you know, it's not as scary because it's not going at the end like it is for the eastern monarchs. Because of this, we have the very recent evidence of the petition to the Fish and Wildlife Service. The World Wildlife Fund named them one of the top 10 species to watch in 2010. Way back in 1983, monarchs were put on the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They were listed as an endangered phenomenon, the monarch migration. The monarch as a species wasn't listed, just the migration, the phenomenon of the migration. Okay, so we have this significant decline in monarchs. So what is causing that? Probably like almost any species, not all, but almost any species that we would talk about. This thing is buzzing. I hope that's okay. He's the expert here. It's buzzing in my hand. Is habitat loss. That's probably the most important thing for monarchs. Habitat is being converted. There are all sorts of depressing statistics about this. Oops. In the United States, we're losing over 5,000 acres a day to real estate and energy development. Between 2006 and 2011, more than 1 million acres of native prairie, unplowed prairie, were converted to cropland. All of this land that we've lost contained milkweed and nectar plants. So here's an example of real estate development. So the pessimist in me looks at that and thinks, ugh, that's so depressing. All those houses there where there used to be habitat. But then the optimist in me says, well, there's a lot of green left in that picture. And if we could get people to plant something besides monocultures of Kentucky bluegrass, which is not native in most of the places where it's used, that could be habitat. That couldn't be habitat for wolves or whooping cranes, but it could be habitat for monarchs. So, you know, there is potential. That all is not lost if those people just cared and learned. We've also got a big change in the way agriculture is done in this country. So beginning in the late 1990s, big seed companies made crops that they could put genes into. They could genetically modify crops. And into corn and soybeans, they put a gene that made those crops resistant to the herbicide Roundup. So what that meant is the corn could come up, or the soybeans or the cotton could come up in a field, and the farmer could spray the herbicide after the crops had already emerged. And that is a very effective. If they can only spray the herbicide before the crops have emerged, they're not going to get a lot of the weeds. But if they can spray the herbicide after the crops have emerged, they can kill the weeds much more effectively. It turns out that we had done a study in 2000 that documented the amount of milkweed in cornfields and soybean fields. So here's a cornfield. This is an old slide back before we had digital cameras. It didn't scan all that well, but here's milkweed in between the rows of a cornfield, and that milkweed just keeps growing pretty well all summer long, because the way that farmers controlled weeds then was with a cultivator, and milkweed actually came up pretty well after it had been cultivated. Sometimes it looked even better. Here's a soybean plant. Here's a milkweed plant growing in the soybean field. There's a monarch laying an egg on that. So we calculated that actually more monarchs came out of egg fields than came out of other kinds of habitat back in the year 2000. So then what happened is that habitat is gone. So for a few years, here's a milkweed plant in between rows of soybeans. For a few years, we would still see some milkweed coming up in those fields, but after a few years, that milkweed, it was killed, it was gone. So this is what's happened. This is herbicide, this is adoption rates. So this is the percentage of all of the acreage of corn and soybeans that's herbicide tolerant. Here's soybeans, so starting in the late 1990s, more and more soybean fields. So when we did this study, it was about half of soybean fields were herbicide tolerant. They didn't put it into corn, and it didn't get okayed by the US EPA until the mid-2000s. So now it's up to about 70% for corn and about 90% of soybeans are herbicide tolerant. So basically, we've lost all of that habitat. And just to give you an idea, depending on the year in the United States, it's between 80 and 90 million acres are in corn, and approximately the same amount as in soybeans. 80 to 90 million acres is as big as Germany. So that is the habitat that's been lost. I think we need to remember that all of that habitat was lost to most species long before it was lost to monarchs. So in a way, monarchs were kind of lucky that they grew on a plant that could tolerate weed control in those fields until pretty recently. And now their luck has run out in those fields. So this is kind of when we saw, when we started getting these big, big numbers in the middle 2000s, that's when the monarch population started declining very significantly. There's also habitat loss in Mexico. So there was just a big logging report on this mountain, Cerro Pelon, which is the place where Fred Urquhart, who discovered monarch colonies in 1976. So this is a mountaintop. You can see that's been logged already. More was just logged recently. It used to be logged with big scale logging operations. Now it's what they call horse logging, or sometimes it's called ant logging. They're just like a few logs being brought down from the mountain. This is happening right where the monarchs are. Great big trees are being cut down. So there's habitat loss in their overwintering sites. There's overwintering habitat loss in Mexico, or in California, not just in Mexico. 62 of 458 historic roosting sites, so all these sites along the coast of California have been lost. This is prime real estate. That it's really hard to protect that kind of habitat. Lots of other things. Climate change is a big one, so it's something that I'm doing a lot of work on. We know that climate change is predicted to cause more extreme climate events, so winter storms and drought. What that can do is alter the location of the optimum habitat, either because of these extreme climate conditions or because of kind of directional changes in temperature or precipitation. So decreasing precipitation often, increasing temperature. So the optimum place for monarchs to be might be changing. For example, we did some models, and these models predicted that in the year 2055, it would be too hot here in August for monarchs. Right now, we saw a lot of monarchs in August, but that, their range is moving north under different climate change predictions. Climate could also change the range of the plants they depend on, their milkweed or the OML fir trees that they roost on in Mexico. It could also alter the timing of their predators or parasitoids. So if climate change helps their predators or parasitoids, that could harm monarchs. So there are lots of mechanisms by which climate change could affect monarchs. This picture right here is kind of an interesting one. In 2002, usually monarchs, it's a dry season where they are in Mexico, so they don't get a lot of precipitation. But in 2002, there was a rainstorm that was followed by freezing temperatures and then a snowstorm. And what happened is the monarchs were knocked out of the trees, and it was too cold for them. They literally froze to death. And 80% of the population died that winter. And what climate change scenarios predict is more frequent events like this. There was a big, huge rainstorm in 2010. It caused landslides and trees to go down. Luckily, it wasn't followed by freezing temperatures, so the monarchs survived that storm. Other factors, insecticide use. There are invasive species. There's an invasive species called a swallowwort, which is in a closely related genus to monarchs. And monarch females will lay eggs on it, but the caterpillars can't develop on it. This is reported in Minnesota if you look at the USDA range maps, but I've never seen it in Minnesota. It's fairly common in Michigan, but it's kind of what we call a sink. Monarchs could lay their eggs on it, but the caterpillars won't develop. There's a disease that monarchs get. These are scales from the abdomen of a monarch, and these little football-shaped things here are spores of a parasite that is a debilitating parasite for monarchs, and for some reason, we don't know why, the incidence of that parasitoid is increasing, or that parasite is increasing. And I had a guy call me about a week ago, and he said, I know what's killing all the monarchs. It's collisions with vehicles. He said, we have all these east-west highways in the United States, and you come back, and these poor butterflies are trying to migrate south, and they keep getting hit by trucks and cars. So lots of problems. So many, many causes to their decline. So this is a big problem for conservation biologists. How do we respond to something like this that has so many different causes? So this is how we shouldn't respond. We shouldn't assume there's nothing we can do. That's giving up, and I am not ready to give up. We could just hang our heads and say there's too much bad going on, so forget monarchs, or forget everything else that uses their habitat. So we also shouldn't argue about whose fault the problem is, and that's something that happens often. Because this is a multi-country problem, for a long time there was finger pointing in the United States saying, Mexico, you guys are cutting down those trees that the monarchs overwinter on. That's causing the decline, and there really was finger pointing, and now there's the same kind of finger pointing going north over the border, that you guys in the United States have planted all of these GM crops. People in Mexico are very concerned. They don't grow GM crops in Mexico. It's illegal. So they're really concerned about that and saying, it's your fault. So that really doesn't do a lot of good, to argue about whose fault it is. And we also get this, people saying, well, we shouldn't do anything about invasive species. We shouldn't waste our energy on these problems when the big thing is habitat loss, so all we should care about is habitat loss. Because when a population is low, any little problem can be bad, because there are fewer individuals, so the relative effect of even these smaller causes can be more important. So I think if we understand one cause to the decline, we should, and we have the power to do something about it, we should, even if it's not the biggest one. Okay, so I'm going to go back to what I started with. Conservation requires knowledge. So in order to solve these problems, we need to understand them. So we need to monitor monarchs. We need to get people out, even more people out, documenting what's going on with monarchs so we can document declines, but we can also document successes. If we're doing something right, like this summer, how many people saw more monarchs than they saw last summer? Yeah, you were right. There were more monarchs out there this year. We need to understand why. Okay, what happened? Maybe there's something we can duplicate. Maybe there's something we can do if we understand some of the successes. We need to study the factors. We need to understand what affects monarch survival and movement and reproductive success. And we need to understand climate change. Right now, all conservation has to be done in the context of climate change. We need to be preparing for the future and understanding climate change. We need to make all these species resilient to climate change and able to withstand what we're throwing at them. And the way to do that is to make them strong now. But also, conservation requires action. So here are some things that we can all do to help monarchs. The most important thing we can do is to try to address habitat loss. We may live in an apartment, not have access to land that we own, but we might go to a nature center, we might have friends. There are things we can do to make sure there's more nectar and milkweed resources available to monarchs. It's hard for us. We don't live in Mexico. We probably don't have a lot of individual control, but there are conservation organizations working on preserving that habitat in Mexico. Plan for climate change again. You can tell I'm big on climate change. We can educate and advocate. We can talk to people about monarchs. We can talk to our neighbors about, I have not been successful at this, but I'm trying. Talk to my neighbors about getting rid of their Kentucky bluegrass. Educate kids, get as many people as we can involved with monarch conservation. That's what you guys at the zoo are doing so well. We can support organizations that are working to preserve monarchs and pollinators. So anyone that's out there doing it, support them, support their efforts. All right, and I said at the beginning, conservation requires hope. So I think it's very hopeful that President Obama wrote a memorandum about monarchs. That's pretty cool. This is another long list. The point is not what's on it. The point is the length of it. These are organizations, nonprofit organizations, federal agencies, international agencies that are working on monarch conservation. It's a species of special concern in Canada. Mexico has passed presidential decrees to protect the overwintering sites. Lots and lots of things going on in all three countries and across the three countries are collaborative efforts. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about something that's going on in the United States. I have some handouts from this organization here. It's actually centered or led at the University of Minnesota. We have the coordinator here, and I'm the chair of the steering committee. But this is a group of many, many different organizations, from very small little nature centers to big federal agencies that are working together. You probably recognize some of these names up here, that are working together on conserving monarchs. And what we're trying to do is coordinate our efforts and make sure that we're doing the best job we can to save monarchs. Our vision, we have a vision, abundant monarch populations that can be sustained in perpetuity, and promoting monarchs, like you said, as a flagship species. We're basing our action on the North American Monarch Conservation Plan, which was supported by the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, which is sort of the environmental branch of NAFTA. When NAFTA formed 20 years ago, people were really concerned about the environmental impacts of free trade within North America, so they formed this Commission for Environmental Cooperation. They hired a group of us to write this North American Monarch Conservation Plan. So the joint venture bases its actions on this conservation plan. We have goals in habitat conservation, education, outreach, and research and monitoring. So we support and inform programs in all of these different areas. So if we think of the habitat conservation, we're promoting big habitats like this piece of CRP land in Minnesota. We're promoting little habitats like this Rochester school where the kids are out planting a butterfly garden. We're promoting habitats along roadside. You can argue about that, but roadsides provide connectivity. You know, there are probably some monarchs that get killed, but in many places, that's the only habitat that's left. And in all of these cases, we're providing the food that the caterpillars need, the milkweed that they need, and the nectar sources that they need. In some places, not so much in the upper Midwest, but in some places in the country, there's a shortage of native milkweed seeds available. So we prioritize states to develop sources of seeds for people to plant in habitat restoration projects. I show you at the bottom of all these slides the partners that are involved in each of these efforts. We've assigned priority milkweeds for each of these regions of the country. So, you know, if you live in the Northeast, what kind of milkweed species should you grow? And there's just this incredible diversity of beautiful milkweeds. This one is actually a fairly common one in Minnesota, but a lot of people would look at it and not think it's a milkweed. It's got these skinny little leaves, almost like pine needles. It's Asclepias verticillata, or whorled milkweed. This is a really cool, these are all Minnesota ones. This is another cool one called poke milkweed, which has the best scientific name. It's Asclepias exaltata. So really, really cool plants. Promoting planting of nectar sources that are available all year. So, you know, plants that are available in the spring. Somewhere I have a picture of lilacs here, so we kind of go, you know, we cover the season here with the joke pies that are just finishing now, the blazing stars. So getting the middle of the summer, bee balm. So plants that are available all year. Lots and lots of other habitat conservation projects that our different partners are working on with, you know, installing habitat, getting way stations going, habitat restoration projects on federal land, state land. So all sorts of different things that are going on. We got monarchs listed as a species of greatest conservation need in Mexico, or excuse me, in Minnesota. So that was kind of exciting. Research and monitoring. So we're really trying to promote more monitoring because understanding monarchs requires not just a few scientists working where they are, but it requires people all over. So we're picking areas where there are data gaps and going and doing workshops to get more people doing the monitoring, variety of research approaches. So we really think that citizen science, or the involvement of citizens, is really important to figuring out what's going on with monarchs. Here are some pictures of different people out doing monitoring. This is, I really love this picture. My husband, we do this monarch larva monitoring project at the University of Minnesota, and my husband always said your volunteers are little old ladies in tennis shoes. And I said, pretty soon I'm going to be a little old lady in tennis shoes, maybe never little, but certainly old. We're evaluating the overwintering habitat in California, so doing comparisons using satellite images of what's happening to overwintering sites. Compiling all of the data from these overwintering sites in California. Promoting a lot of education outreach, so handouts, brochures, you know, getting kids involved, doing these monitoring workshops and nature centers all over the country. So lots and lots of outreach activities. Here's some of these workshops. Another little old lady in tennis shoes. We're working with teachers, so these North American Monarch Institutes, where we go all over the country and do workshops. This is in Chicago. These are teachers coming and learning about monarchs, so we hopefully get more situations like this going. We're making more connections between kids and monarchs. So a lot of resources we're developing. Monarch Festivals. How many people were at the Monarch Festival? Good. You would just raise your hand every time. So this is from the Minneapolis Monarch Festival. They have this very cool fun run and music, and it's just a neat event. Okay, so there's a lot we can do, and I'm very hopeful because people are so dedicated to saving monarchs that we can do something. But I also think that I'm never going to go to Mexico again and see 20 hectares of land covered by monarchs. And I kind of got a question. I talked to a lot of reporters. And one time a reporter said, so what's going to happen with people's interest in monarchs when they don't see them when they're kids? You know, are we going to lose this connection with people if they aren't as familiar and aren't as common as they have been? And that, you know, usually I get questions that I've answered a million times before, but that one I really was, whoa, that's a pretty interesting question. So after he asked me that question, I've thought a lot about that. So what does it mean if we're getting to a new normal? I mean, hopefully it's going to be sustainable, but what does it mean if it's going to be so low that monarchs are not as familiar as they used to be? So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's very common. We're not going to see repeats of the large numbers that were common a decade ago. So I think what it means is that we really need to work harder to maintain public interest in monarchs. And you know, I have studied monarchs for 30 years, but I'm not so, you know, narrow. My focus is not so narrow that I think all that matters is monarchs. I really do think that preserving monarchs is going to benefit a lot of other organisms as well by making those connections and providing that habitat. So I think it's going to be a little harder, that we're going to need to work to maintain this public interest in monarchs. And then what we need to do is make sure that this new normal is sustainable. We've got to have enough habitat so that the monarchs can survive something like that storm that happened in 2002, and to a lesser extent another one happened in 2004. So, you know, it's really going to take a concerted effort to ensure that this new low number that I'm pretty sure we're going to see is something that can survive. And I think that our efforts with respect to monarch conservation are going to be worthwhile. I think that it's going to be worth our time and our money and all of our sweat and tears to save monarchs. And here are some reasons, and I'm sure there are many more that you could think of, but what's cool about monarchs is they exist in this really interesting mosaic of rare and pristine habitat. They live in undisturbed virgin prairie, but they also can live on a milkweed plant that's growing between the cracks in your sidewalk, you know, in the middle of Minneapolis. They'll find that milkweed plant in the cracks in the sidewalk or in highly disturbed land. I mean, nothing is more disturbed than a cornfield. Every year it gets plowed and sprayed, and you know, they used to be able to grow in cornfields. So that's pretty cool that they can live in that variety of habitats, and they represent a lot of other organisms. So by saving those prairies, we're saving a lot of other organisms. By saving those city gardens, we're saving organisms as well. So that's a neat thing about monarchs, is they use a variety of kinds of habitats. I think they're also incredibly interesting, and there's a lot more we can learn from them. A lot more we can learn about the world. Also have this incredible migration that's an unmatched biological phenomenon. There are other insects that migrate. They just got surpassed. There's a species of dragonfly in Asia that migrates farther than monarchs. But monarchs have this incredibly regular migration that's more like a bird migration or a whale migration, or, you know, it's just really organized and regular. And that's unmatched. There is no other insect that does it like monarchs do. So I'm going to end there. I have stand on the shoulders of giants. I've had incredible people to work with, so this talk is the result not just of my work, but many, many other people. These are all the students I've had over the years, a very, very cool group of people. I've worked with the Monarch Butterfly Fund, Monarch Joint Venture, citizens, scientists, all the people in the governments, and I'm also a terrible photographer. So all these people contributed pictures to this talk. So thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer your questions. Yes. Sure. So a way station is basically a habitat for monarchs. And the word way station comes from the stations that used to be when slaves were escaping to the north. There were way stations of people that were willing to harbor them during their journeys. So a way station is a place that monarchs have during their northward and their southward migratory journeys, or for their staying in the north. There's a place that harbors monarchs. And you know, any habitat, your garden could be a way station, a 40-acre prairie, and it's just kind of a gimmick, really. You get a sign. So you pay some money and get a sign, and you're advertising the fact that you're creating monarch habitat. The requirements are milkweed and a certain number of nectar plants. And this is run through the Monarch Watch program. So if you Google Monarch way stations, Monarch Watch, and I think I did not bring handouts about it, but, or you could, yeah, if you Google Monarch way stations, you'll find out about it. Yes?
Way stations are cool and fine, and I'll keep making more, but it seems like when I drive down 35, you get into Iowa, you look in ditches, you go, oh, Monarchs would like that. And it doesn't seem that way in Minnesota. And I wonder about the Minnesota Department of Transportation changing seed mixes for ditches to be able to do that. And
so,
what do you think of
thank you.
It just seems night and day when you, oh, look, the prairie, and not because it's there. No, they didn't grow.
Yep. So that is an excellent point. Iowa passed a law that said that Iowa roadsides have to be managed for biodiversity. So the first goal of roadside management is human safety. So that's first. But within the constraints of human safety, Iowa roadsides are managed for biodiversity. And that started with managing for pheasants and birds, but now it really does include butterflies. So I was actually just in Ames a couple weeks ago talking to people who do that. So Iowa has really strong county governments that do a lot. So most counties in Iowa have a conservation person who's in charge of the roadsides. So they're seed production, prairie seed production in Iowa is very strong because the state is a huge customer. And whenever you get customers for native seeds, you get good production. So there's something called the Tallgrass Prairie Center in Iowa that produces a lot of the seed they use. So that's something I wish we did in Minnesota. And we're kind of working on that. One of the things the joint venture is doing, because roadside management is kind of a state and county level thing. We get pushback on that because people say all the monarchs are gonna get killed by cars, but no, I totally, yeah. So I think a county road that has prairie along the edge is gonna produce more monarchs than it kills, in my opinion. Yes.
Just as an addition to that, I live in Scott County, and driving through, particularly Prior Lake, they're not mowing anywhere near as much, and there's a lot more native plants that I've seen. But I have a question. I'm doing a prairie restoration of about 7 acres down near Jordan. I have been renting my land to my neighbor who's been farming it with GMO crops. Once I got educated about this, I'm not going to do that anymore. So with the Soil and Water from Scott County, I'm doing that restoration. But my question is, any residue? Do I need to be concerned about residue from those GMO?
You know, if you were an organic food grower, you'd have to wait a certain number of years before you could certify your crops as organic, or your food as organic. But really, Roundup, as herbicides go, is not that bad. It is gone from the soil pretty quickly. I mean, there is some residue, but it's not. You're gonna be able to grow prairie plants there, and that's. I'm a little.
The seeds, though. I mean, the seeds that have been genetically altered and grew into the ground with their roots.
Yeah, you know, corn and soybeans don't have very deep roots. They're annuals. So yeah, I think you're going to be fine. You know, maybe a little bit of an issue, but not a big issue. Yep. you'll be okay there. Yep. Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that the butterflies are laying fewer eggs. There have been any research done on that. I used to watch a butterfly in my backyard, and I could go out and pick 30, 40 eggs from the one visit. And now, if you're seeing a butterfly, and they'll be 2 to 6 eggs. Has there been any research on the weakness or strength of these?
Of individual. We haven't seen anything in our lab, so we can count really accurately how many eggs females lay. One thing that does seem to be happening is there seems to be higher levels of disease incidence, and that's a hard thing to study. So we're kind of looking at data from the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project and trying to see that. But I know I've been rearing monarchs since 1985, and until maybe a decade ago, I had almost no mortality. And, you know, it was very easy to rear monarchs. It has become more difficult to rear monarchs. And, you know, I don't know the reason for that. I mean, it seems to be a disease problem, and we really don't understand that. So, you know, that could be a manifestation of what you're seeing. But we haven't noticed that with our monarchs that do survive. We haven't noticed that they lay fewer eggs. So I don't know the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Maybe a little bit of a factor. If people, bees use a broader variety of nectar sources. Monarchs tend to go to things that produce a lot of nectar. So what would be a problem is if somebody had a butterfly garden and they bought all of their plants for that butterfly garden in a place where they were treated with neonicotinoids. And, you know, we know that the neonicotinoids, for people that don't know, neonicotinoids are a fairly new class of insecticides that are systemic insecticides. So, you know, old-fashioned insecticides, they'd spray them and they'd be on the leaves and they'd prevent the leaves from getting eaten by herbivores. But now these neonicotinoids are in the whole plant, in the pollen and the nectar and the leaves and the stem and the roots. So they're more effective as insecticides. But on a big scale, like in a big prairie, you know, the weeds that monarchs or the plants that monarchs would normally nectar from, they're probably not getting a lot of exposure to neonicotinoids, but, you know, some. And I think gardens are the places we need to worry about. So it's important if you're planting a butterfly garden to make sure that the plants have not been treated with insecticides, especially neonicotinoids, which takes them a long time to get that out of their system. It depends on, I knew I shouldn't have said that as I was saying it. It depends on how much they've been treated with. Did any of you know the answer to that, Eric? Do you? Yeah, if they've been treated with a high dose, yeah, it can be long. She said 7 years. But I think, you know, you can give them a lower dose that, looking at Eric, he's shrugging his shoulders. If Eric doesn't know, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Ooh, excellent question. Yes. Monarchs are a North American species, but they have been moved to a lot of other places in the world. So they're very well established in New Zealand and Australia and Hawaii and a lot of other Pacific oceans. And we don't have the records of exactly how they got there, but we know when they got there in the late 1800s. And what's kind of interesting about that is they get plopped down in a new place that's very different than their old place, and they do just fine. They just adapt. So in Australia, they migrate in response to dry conditions. And in Hawaii, they don't migrate at all. So they just kind of go and figure out the new location and do it right in that location. That's one of the reasons I'm kind of hopeful about monarchs is they are pretty resilient. They can adapt to changes. So with respect to climate change, I think as long as we keep them having habitat, they'll be okay. But yeah, and now, so I'm working on a book on monarchs right now, and there are pretty well established populations of monarchs in southern Spain and Portugal. And and the Azores Islands, and some people think they get blown all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. We don't know for sure how they get there. Yeah.
So I remember back in second grade, a long time ago, when the school wanted to raise logical awareness, each kid got a little tree from home, planted it or whatever. Why aren't, or are they? I don't know if they are, but it seems relatively cheap to raise awareness.
So that's a complicated question. At our lab at the University of Minnesota, we used to kind of do that. At the peak of it, in the mid 2000s, we were distributing like 7,000 to 10,000 monarchs every year. Back in the day when they were really easy to rear. Mostly to teachers and schools, and some of those teachers did give every kid an egg. We no longer do that, and I don't advocate that anymore, because as the population has declined, and as I and many other people are having more trouble rearing monarchs, I'm really concerned about the potential for negative consequences to the population. So if you give every kid an egg, those eggs had to be mass reared. There are a lot of possible problems with mass rearing. Disease is one. Monarchs are not meant to be reared under really crowded conditions. They're not normally gregarious insects. Some insects are. Their offspring stay together on a plant. They're used to being crowded, but monarchs aren't. So disease, there's issues if you have a breeder that's rearing a lot of monarchs. Probably those monarchs weren't collected from a lot of genetic stock, and those breeders might not have the knowledge that like a zoo would have about keeping track of the husbandry and the lineages of all those insects, so you might get inbreeding problems. And also, there's really good evidence that if you keep a population, people that breed insects or other organisms to release as endangered species think a lot about the consequences of keeping these insects in a lab condition for generation after generation, because they can evolve quickly and adapt to those laboratory conditions. And if you release them into the wild, they might, not do as well in the wild. We also know that the diseases, for example, there's really good evidence in bumblebees that diseases of butterflies that have been released from captive rearing situations have brought diseases into native populations. So I don't do that anymore, and I don't advocate for it. I agree, and that's why I did it for so long, because I think it's a great idea, making those connections. But it just came for me, it became this balance between the educational value and the conservation risks, and all of a sudden that teeter-totter tipped in the risk side for me.
This might kind of be a slight tangent now to the question I was just asked. When you take monarchs, monarch watch, and you fill out your little form for the monarchs to submit, one of the columns you fill in, just caught the monarch and wild caught monarch versus whether it was here monarch. Have that some evidence of what's being covered?
Unfortunately not. We don't, the organizers of that citizen science project are working on analyzing those data, but they haven't yet. So we don't know the answer to that. Okay, his question was, so there's this tagging program where people put tags on monarch wings, and it's a unique number, and those monarchs sometimes get found. And we know about those monarchs if they were reared in captive conditions or they were just caught as a wild adult. So his question was, do we see a difference in recovery rates between captive reared and wild ones? And it would be really interesting if we did know that, but we don't. Yes.
Okay. It seems like a lot of eggs after a certain point in the season I collected just never did anything, and it was late in the season. Do you think
Boy, that would be pretty maladaptive to be programmed to self-destruct. So her question was if she's getting poor success at the end of the season. So that could be just, I've never noticed that before, and actually I have data that I'm going to go back and look. But my guess is if you collected a lot of eggs, in your yard or somewhere, where'd you get those eggs? Yeah. So all those eggs could have been from one female, and it could have been just a problem with that one female. It could be just coincidence that it's at the end of the season. It's a little cooler at the end of the season, so it would take them longer to hatch, but I don't know of any evidence that they're programmed to self-destruct. Okay. Yes.
Is there a difference in a hand-reared versus a wild born monarch in their ability to migrate?
So she said, is there a difference in the hand-reared versus the wild-caught butterflies and their ability to migrate? And the answer to that is it depends on how well they were reared. So probably if they were reared under conditions that didn't really mimic the outside conditions very well, it could hinder their ability to migrate, because the butterflies that migrate are getting cues from their external environment, day length, angle of the sun in the sky, temperature. And if they're in a place that's, the lights are on late at night when it's dark outside, that would be a problem for them. But if they're kept under conditions that mimic the outside very well, probably not. So I don't have anything against rearing, going outside, collecting a monarch and rearing it yourself. That basically you're probably saving its life, because 98% of monarchs die before they become adults. From all those eggs that are laid, the vast majority get eaten by insects or die for some reason or another. So if you find a caterpillar in your yard and bring it in your house, the very strong odds are you're saving its life. But you should, do your best to rear it in a healthy way, keep it clean, keep it fed, everything, and also to mimic outside conditions so it doesn't get messed up. Yes. All right. Okay, we have some questions. So I'll answer these two questions, and then I will be happy to stay longer, but I just want to give people, so let's answer these two questions, and then if you need to go home, don't feel badly. I'm not offended if you leave. So, but I'll stay as long as people still have questions. Okay. Here. Yep. You can transplant them. How long did you save the seeds? I've saved them that long and they did okay. Common milkweed is uncommonly hard to grow for me. All of the other kinds grow really well, tropical or swamp milkweed and butterfly weed and that swirled milkweed that I really like. But yeah, if you should cold stratify them, so they need to go in the freezer or outside or something in the winter time. Otherwise, they won't come up. But transplanting milkweed is not that hard. Common milkweed has a really long taproot, but you don't need that whole taproot. So I move it around in my garden a lot, and just get as much of that root as I can, and it will come up. And yeah. Nope. You can cut it back, let it go. Yeah, or you can even pull up common milkweed, because you just get it kind of down to the taproot, and it'll grow back if you pull it. As long it's got a really long root, and you're not going to get that whole root, and it'll come back probably better than it was before. Okay, one more question over here, and then we'll let people go.
I just had a question about
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is that detrimental to crops at all?
Well, so that's a good question, and I actually had this dream the other night that the NBC Nightly News came to our lab. They're going to do a thing on their nightly news on the weekend, and I was not super impressed with the lady trying to explain to her the very answer to her question was, was milkweed in the fields detrimental to the crops? So, you know, I'm sure a lot of you are gardeners and weeds are a problem. There weren't that many milkweeds in cornfields, so they probably weren't causing a problem, but farmers want to control weeds. They would never be successful if they didn't control weeds, so you can't really blame them. For there's this new technology that's more effective. It's much easier than going out and cultivating. I mean, they sometimes spray this Roundup. It can be sprayed from big, airplanes, but it can also be sprayed from, you know, huge whatever's that go through the fields and have a, you know, they're super wide and they get a whole bunch of rows at once. So both airplanes and tractors that go through the field. So, you know, I can't really blame them. They're making a living and they need to control weeds. So I think this lady kept trying to make me say I hate GMOs and I hate farmers, and I don't hate farmers, and I understand they're trying to make a living. I personally think that the way that we produce food in this country is kind of messed up. You know, I just did some reading about this after she kept trying to make me say that, and that's how I learned that there are 80 to 90 or 8 to 9 or some huge number of the area the size of Germany is covered with corn, and 37% of that corn is used to produce ethanol. That's not feeding the world. 37% of that corn is fed to to animals. That's a very inefficient way to get food. 11% of that corn is used to make products to feed people in the United States, and most of that 11% is used to make high fructose corn syrup, which we could probably all do without. 11% goes to other countries, so we could say 11, that's what they all say, we're feeding the world. 11% goes to other countries. That's what's feeding the rest of the world besides the United States. And, you know, we don't have good statistics on what they use it for. In Mexico, they use it for tortillas. So that's probably the healthiest thing that corn gets turned into. So, you know, but changing that is the way we as a society have decided to use that land in the United States. And there's nothing that we can do quickly enough to save monarchs or other species. So we need to look at the other land that's not in those fields. And then we can, in other parts of our lives, try to, you know, change that messed up system of producing food, or of use, you know, it's not even just producing food, it's producing other stuff. So, but that's kind of, we can't make that change fast enough. So that was like way tangent as an answer to your question, but it's just because I had a dream about it. So yeah, I mean, you can't blame farmers for controlling weeds in a very effective way of control. So probably not in between the rows anymore, but certainly I think, I mean, we do have incentives in this country for conservation, like the CRP program, where farmers are paid to keep land that has environmental sensitivity out of production. And so, you know, that's one of the things we're working on, and that's what we're talking about with all these agency people who all of a sudden have to be concerned about monarch conservation. We do need to incentivize them. And, you know, if you drive through and look at farm yards, they're often very big. That land could be, you know, some of the lawns in agricultural areas. In other states besides Iowa, they could do the roadsides, other kinds of right-of-ways besides roadside right-of-ways, like utility line right-of-ways and railroad right-of-ways. So there's a lot of land left on the margins that all we can do is hope that that will be enough for monarchs. I doubt that we're going to see much milkweed in between the rows of corn for a pretty long time. What we need to do is get rid of some of that corn, in my humble opinion. All right, thank you for your great questions. have a few handouts out here. Some of them I brought enough of, some of them